Today I want to start talking about HTML forms. I think from the perspective of a web programmer, this is one of the more important topics and one that seems to be very dynamic in HTML5 because the different form components are still being developed as we speak. Even though the standard is fairly stable, when it comes to form inputs, that's where our browsers start behaving a little bit differently. Stuff we're going to talk about today is pretty straightforward, pretty basic stuff, but as we get into the new HTML5 form components, then things are different. So we're going to start with the basics and then work our way from there. To get started, let's open up the main form for this evaluation form start folder. Inside there I have some CSS, I have some images, and I have the evaluation form itself. It's not called index, could be. If you don't like it, change its name, but that's what I'm going to evaluate here. And while I'm at it, I don't think I'll even double click it. Let's just take a quick look at what's in there. Nothing real exciting at the top. You can clean some of that up if you wish. There is a piece of JavaScript. This is your first introduction to JavaScript. Firefox has a interesting, let's call it, feature where if you reload a form that has data in the fields, it leaves the data in there. So if you refresh, if somebody's filling out a form to order something and they refresh that form accidentally, the data doesn't get lost. And so it's a feature, but from our purposes, if it keeps leaving our test data in there, it messes up our testing. So all this little piece of JavaScript does is it points to the form that'll be on the form, and every time we load the window, we reset it. So that basically in Firefox just wipes out all the inputs and puts them back to the original values. It's a Firefox only thing. I haven't tested it without in Firefox 30 or whatever level we're up to right now. Maybe they've taken that feature out, but I would be surprised because I think Firefox kind of liked that idea. So I've left that in there. That's just a small piece of JavaScript. We'll learn more about what all that stuff does in the next unit. I've also linked in my evaluation form CSS. Right now, all this form really has is a header. Could probably put that into a header. Didn't bother with it. A couple of images, a title, and another title. So let's just take a quick look. Nothing too exciting. Right. So here's centered stuff, and if you make it bigger, it looks a little different, but that's what I got so far. So now what we want to do to this form or page is add a form. So in my CSS, not my CSS, my HTML, I'm just putting a bunch of blank lines in so I can scroll this up. I'm going to add a form tag. The form tag is a two-sided tag, as you can imagine. Everything in between here is part of the form, one form. Most forms include a bunch of inputs, as many as you need, and a submit button, maybe a reset button, many buttons as you want, really, but most forms on the web have two buttons. A submit, meaning I'm done, send the data, and a clear button saying I really want to start over. Those are the two. You're not limited to two. A web page can have multiple forms, but that's pretty rare. We'll see it a little bit more in web data management where we have different sections of the form that do different things. We have little mini forms. But for this class, it'll be one form per page. We've got a lot of stuff to do beyond the form to have multiple forms. There's really no value to it. Each form, if you have multiples, is separate. So if they will each have their own submit button. When you submit the mini form, only the data from the mini form gets sent. When you hit the submit button from a larger form, all of the larger form data gets sent, but never the two mixed. There's no way to do that. So it is possible, it's just fairly rare. All right, inside my form element, we've got a couple other things that we need to do. First of all, most forms have an ID, and this form has to have an ID because my JavaScript says, when we load the window, reset the form with the ID, the form. Kind of a lame name. If you want to change it, you have to change it here. That's what it is in the JavaScript. and then you can call it whatever you want here. So I could call this form FRM evaluation, that's fine. Two more things. The next thing is the method that this form uses to send its data. There are two kinds of methods, post and get. This isn't going to make a whole lot of sense in this unit, or pardon me, in this class, but in web data management, the two differences between them, post and get, will become a little more apparent. If there's data on the form, that data, if you designate get, shows up as part of the address. You may have filled out some forms, and the next time you go back, it's got the form name and then a bunch of plus signs with all your data in it. That's a get form. The danger with get forms, you have passwords. They're listed in open source, open text format, so that's not a great idea for those kinds of pages. Right? But occasionally it comes in handy. And again, next semester we'll explain it a little bit more. This semester, make everything a post. Actually, I might be able to demonstrate it when we get past here. Finally, the third part of this is the form's action. When the user submits this form using the submit button, what should we do? Can leave that blank. Nothing happens if you leave it blank. You can put a mail to in there to yourself, to your email address, if you have a built-in mail server. I mean, but a built-in Outlook application type of thing, mail application. Remember we said mail to only works if you've got Outlook or some similar mail application installed. Same thing with that. But if you do that, what you get is just a big old long string of characters of what the user put in their form. What I developed a couple of years ago that seems to work quite well is a form on my website called HTML form test. If we send it to that, it's a PHP form that pretties up your data for you. And that's a good way to test your form. So let's make that our action. So in the action here, we're going to do an HTTP www or www.volkergall.com MSTC HTML, forgot what it was called already, HTML all caps form test. It's an interesting capitalization. HTML form test.php. It's a PHP page. Hopefully it's still, yeah, it's still there. I tested this before class. So using that as an action, when you submit your form, it actually takes all the data out of all the objects on your form, text boxes and check boxes and radio buttons, sends it to my server, and then my server sends back a page, basically says, here's what I got, all prettied up. In the future, we will put but Apache server addresses in there, local host addresses in there. We will send actions of different kinds. But for this purpose, for the purposes of this class and the testing we're doing, that's probably all you need to do. Question?
So this is how I can send the thing to FatCal and this will test?
You can test it. Okay, in your own forms, but no, it's lost once you're done because it doesn't go into a database or anything. It just echoes it back to you. Okay, so there's my form. Anything else we need here? Action we just did, send it there. You can put your email address in there. Okay, and it sends you all the data in a concatenated form, which is hard to read, but you get the data. We talked about one page, multiple tags. Okay, now inside that form, we're going to have multiple input tags. Most inputs use the input tag. There are many new ones now, and we're going to stumble on one pretty quickly called a text field or text area, that doesn't use an input tag, but most input are done with an input tag. Each type then controls what appears on the screen. If you designate the type as text, you get a text box. If you designate password, you get a text box that puts dots on the screen when you type the password. Checkbox gives you checkbox, radio buttons, a hidden data type. Not going to need it too much in this class, but in PHP, that's how we get one version of the website or web page to communicate with the next version of the web page by sending them hidden data that the user never sees. Well, we'll demonstrate that. Type submit is a submit button, a reset button, a regular old button that we can control completely. And finally, there's an image button as well that we can use to create a button that is really nothing but an image. Normal buttons, submit, reset, and button buttons have the gray box around them. If you don't want that, you just want a button that looks like a picture, then you use an image. But it's an input type, and it's automatically treated as a submit button. So there's our two kinds of buttons. A button, we have to designate what kind of button it is, but it gives us a little more flexibility. We'll see that when we get there. So let's start by adding a text box. This goes between our two form tags, obviously. Indent to show form ownership. We're going to create an input. It's a one-sided tag. And that's why some of the other ones are a little bit different, why some of the text areas, for instance, are two-sided, because you can put all kinds of stuff inside that text area. But this one is a one-sided tag, so I'm just going to say input, and there's always a type. In this case, we're going to do a text box. I'm going to close it before I forget, but I'm not done yet. Green, the font's big enough for you? Okay. Every input, in addition to its type, should have two other things. First, an ID. This is going to be our username text box, so I'm going to give it an ID. And when I ID my objects on the form, I give them a prefix, like we did in Visual Studio, like I've been doing in Swift. I put a prefix on there. The ID, there are no rules here. You can call it whatever you want, with one thing to consider, that if you duplicate an ID, it really confuses the heck out of JavaScript later. This ID is for JavaScript, which we're going to be hitting in the next unit. And we're going to learn about JavaScript. If JavaScript wants to communicate with this text box, it needs an ID. In addition to that, we should also give this input field a name. Here, I give it the same name without the prefix. This name is what is sent to the PHP page, to the server. So what you'll see when we get there, on the other side, on the server side, is username as the name of the field and then some value that corresponds that we got out of the text box. So this is used locally for JavaScript. This one's used on the server side. And when it gets to the server, it's no longer a text box. It's the contents of the text box. So it's really more a variable name. So my current philosophy is prefixes, object names on the IDs, but not on the data that goes to the server. Brittany?
Oh, I was just going to ask, you can't have white spaces in the name tag?
No, no white space in either of these names, no. That's why I camelback them. Okay, save that. And I'm going to refresh my form. And there's my text box. Ain't it lovely? Well, sort of. First of all, why is it jammed up there inside of my title? My window's kind of big. If I shrink it, it'll move down a little bit. Sooner or later, no, it's never going to. There it goes. I can put some CSS in to push that down. That'll happen later too. So if yours is stuck in between there, you don't like it, shrink your window down until it pops underneath and then leave it there for right now. Check that. Before my form, I'm just going to put in an empty paragraph with a style equals clear both. And this is temporary. Remind me to take it out later. Breaking space, semicolon, end paragraph. Save it. Refresh. And now when I make my form bigger, it sticks and it's not. The clear both says any wrapping that you have, any floating that you have, and both these pictures float. Turn it off. No floating. So these float in between, but now this is underneath. And there's also a blank paragraph, that's why I jumped twice. So that's just that's a temporary thing. So there's my text box. You can click in it and you can type in it and it'll just keep going merrily on its way. If I refresh my form, because of the JavaScript, Firefox wipes that out. If I didn't have the Java, I haven't tested this, but if I took the JavaScript out, the text box normally will just retain its value, which is annoying. Or helpful. Depends on your perspective, I guess. For me, it's annoying.
For Chrome and Internet Explorer, do you have to write your own JavaScript to get it to work?
No, they do it automatically.
Oh, okay.
They don't have the feature built in. Chrome, I can't speak for. Chrome and Firefox generally are very similar. Right? And so they have similar types of features. They're built on the same parser that goes through all the HTML and figures out what's going on underneath. They still handle things somewhat differently, but they're much more similar than the rest. But all the other browsers, as far as I know, when you reset a form, clear the page, no problem. I didn't reset the form, I reloaded it. Okay, a little different. Resetting the page means reset all the inputs, resetting the form. Reloading the form, that's different. Firefox will not reset your inputs, everybody else does. Again, I haven't checked it since Firefox 24, so it's been a long time. What else do we need to know here? We can add labels to things. Right. What's that say? Add a text box. Yeah, that's what I did. These are not quite like VB labels. These actually have function, and it's a tag, and they have a purpose. Right. First of all, for text and screen readers, it allows you, as the page is going through, to read what that text box is for or what that radio button is for. But it also allows us to simplify sometimes form usage. For each one of the labels that we provide, we're also going to provide a for attribute that designates who this label is for. When the page is running, you can click on the label or you can click on the object to get focus. Now, for a text box, that's not terribly valuable. Why would I want to click on the label so that I can type in the text box when I just type in the text box? But for things like radio buttons and check boxes, I don't have to hit the little itty bitty button if it's small. I can hit the words and it'll check the box or uncheck the box or whatever. So that comes in very handy for those. I tend to put a for, I think it's part of our standard for you to put a for attribute in every one of our labels. Labels can appear anywhere. They're just a tag, two-sided. And you can put whatever text you want in between. They can appear before. I sometimes put my labels after my checkboxes because I like the checkbox to come first and then the text that's associated with the checkbox. Either way, save that, refresh, and there's my label. Designed for forms. We could put paragraphs in there. But then it does weird things, and we can put spans in there. So this is designed for forms so that we can label the contents of our forms. As I mentioned, I normally put a for attribute in here, so this is my label for my text username. It's referring to the ID, basically linking these two together. This has dual purposes. If you, Arena's been sharing with me that a lot of his forms are done in tables, so that column A has all the labels in them, and column B has all of the inputs, the input tags in them. And if you don't have any borders on the table, then it looks like a form. It's another way to do it. Ours are going to be kind of ugly for a little while here. Then I'm going to share some CSS with you that cleans them up very quickly. So now that I have the for clause in there, if I save that, come back over here and refresh my page, I can actually click on the label. Liar. Did I refresh? Thought I did. Did I spell it right? Nope. And it gives focus to the object that it's attached to. Again, for text boxes, maybe not so critical, but for radio buttons and checkboxes, that can often come in handy. That's labels. All of our inputs are going to get labels. A little more information about text boxes. We already designated that the type is text. We can also, these are attributes, by the way. They are not styles. They are attributes. Styles make them look different, not behave different. These make them behave different. We can designate a size, which is the width of the box. That's a little different than the max length. The max length is how many characters will you allow in this box. They don't have to match. So I can have, in this case, a size of 25 and a max length of 30. If you type too far, it scrolls away. So you can designate both. So let's do that. For my text box, I'm going to designate a size equals 20. Save it. Refresh. And nothing much happened. Okay, so let's just watch it grow bigger. If I make it a size 50, notice there's no pixels, no nothing. It's roughly characters. So size controls how wide do you want that box to be. Now I'm going to put it back to 20 and designate a max length of 30.
Are there any good websites or anything like that that have these different attributes listed?
www.vokercall.com. W3 Schools has them all, but when you say all, it's kind of like our Swift book. Yeah, right. That's my notes. I've slimmed them down to what you need to make me happy and the ones I use the most, because you're right. There's hundreds, right, of all these attributes that are out there, and maybe not so much for text boxes, because text boxes aren't terribly complex, but yeah, it can make you crazy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I can highlight that, copy it, paste it, 20, 30, and now you can see it scroll away. But I can't type anymore. I'm full. What's the default max? I think it's 255, but don't quote me. So if you know how big you want the field to be, you can set a maximum size. Kind of like in Visual Studio, I don't do it very often. Can use it for validation, but I'm not going to force the user to type no more than 30 and then get stuck. Much rather tell them on the way out as I'm validating that, excuse me, your field is too big, got to go back and fix it. Let them type as much as they want. But you can set the maximum length of characters, number of characters to get put in there. For a text input field, if you want a default value, you can set a value. And that value will be put in the field right away. But that's text. The user can wipe it out. So if there's a default value that occurs more often than not, you can have it plugged into the form right away so the user can just navigate right over it. HTML5 has added an autofocus attribute, which is kind of nice. Used to have to write code for this. I think I'm going to move down to the next line. We used to have to write JavaScript code to make this happen, and we still can, but now we don't have to. Autofocus says when the form refreshes, loads, automatically focus in this box. I hate websites that don't do that. And there's plenty of them. Please log in. Well, couldn't you help me out by putting the cursor in the username box so I don't have to move down there with my mouse? F5. And there we go, already focused. Now that's with the value in there. I think I'm going to pull the value out since you've seen it. And there it's auto-focused on that field. Usually it's the first one on the form. It's not automatic. Just because it's the top field on a form doesn't mean it automatically gets focus. You have to set that. This is the easiest way now to do that. HTML5's added a lot of attributes that make our life here just a little bit simpler. We used to have to write JavaScript for that. All right, what else we got here? Autocomplete, by default, it's on. Meaning your browser will probably remember some of the more frequent entries that you have made in this field. You've seen it in many forms. I just today filled out a grade change request form for Access Intermediate. I type ACC and it says here, how about Access Intermediate? You've used that before. By default, that's on. If you don't want it to be on, you can turn it off. I've never done it. I believe this is for a text field only. Does not work for does not have that feature for a password field if we did one of those. No example. You can, if you wish, provide a list of suggestions. So as you type a couple letters, it gives you some hints. I've experimented with this a little bit, but haven't used it a lot. If you're interested, play with it. Finally, there's a placeholder attribute that puts text in the text box. We saw this in Swift, puts text in the text box. As soon as you start typing, it immediately erases it all. Kind of grayed out. It's your visual clue that this is placeholder text, and you don't have to highlight it to wipe it out, and you can't. I don't have to erase it. Just start typing. If I back up far enough, then the placeholder text comes back again. Also new in HTML5. I think that's it for text. Oh, there's another one. Required. Another one we usually write JavaScript for. Hey, you can't leave this blank. It's a required field. I probably use this, and we can't test it right now. I probably use this and the JavaScript together because not all browsers have quite figured this part out yet. Most of them have. Required says this field cannot be left blank, but it doesn't do anything until you hit the submit button. So if you have a 3 scrolling pages form, and you leave one blank, it'll let you fill out the rest of the form, go merrily on your way, nothing happens until you hit the submit button, and then it checks every field that's designated as required. And if it's not there, it stops at the very first one and says, you got to fill this in. You can create your own custom error message using a title attribute. So if they leave it blank, you can put your error message in. What do you want to say? Every browser does it a little bit differently. Most of them put a pink border around it or something to designate it as an error, and underneath in a title or a tooltip or something, it'll say you need this required field or whatever message you give. What I don't like about that is that it waits until you hit submit. I prefer to write JavaScript like we did in C# where you leave the field and it's required, yells at you with a little error marker right away. And in the JavaScript unit, we'll learn how to do that. But what if they never touch it? Our validation will still mark it, but we could use the required field to designate it as well. It kind of gives a double whammy. I like my technique a little better with the JavaScript, but I want you to know that this one's here. We can't test it right now because we don't have any way to submit the form yet. And so we can't test that the required field is filled in until you have some way to submit a button. We'll add that here pretty soon. All right, let's add another field. Let's call this one comments, and this one's going to be a text area. This is not an input tag. It is a text area tag with default text in between. So you could put lines and lines and lines and lines of code here. But one caution, the text area includes all the extra characters that you type between text area and end text area. So if you put a few spaces in there to line things up nice and neat, those spaces go in the text area. Press the carriage return a couple of times, those things go in the text area. So everything between the begin and end text area tags are automatically included as text. It's almost like raw text, as if you were typing in raw text. So let's add one of those. I'm going to start by one thing, I'm going to ask you to do this just to get in the habit. Between inputs, I'm going to suggest you put a break. The reason I suggest that is the styles that I'm going to give you later on actually format the break to make the page, make the form look the way we want it to look. So I'm going to steal a label because I have a label for just about all of my inputs. And this one's going to be called TXT comments with a label of comments. And then a text area. And something simple. According to my notes, we could put a placeholder on that, but I'm just going to put this in there for right now. And my form's a little ugly, but we'll fix ugly later. Notice the text areas now can be resized on the fly. Nothing we had to do to make that happen, just happened automatically. If you wish, in my notes, it tells you can put in the number of rows and the X and Y coordinates of how big you want this text area to be, if you want to designate a certain amount. But what I really want to designate is, let's say that my line is getting kind of long, so I'm just going to move text area, the text part of it, down. Now, I haven't tested this, so I'm not out on a limb, but I'm pretty sure this is the way this works. Because I've moved it down, in most HTML, that's just white space. It ignores it, and you get one space. But because we're inside of a text area tag, yuck. What's this? The enter key, I understand. I move that down, but what's this? That's the space between here and there. And the tabs, probably. And those got included. So that's kind of annoying. Remember that when you're using a text area, particularly if it's got a lot of text, that unless you want carriage returns, you better get it all over here to the left margin if you're going to start the next line, or just string it all in one big piece of text and let it wrap where it needs to. So keep that in mind. As I mentioned, you can set rows equal to sum. How many rows deep do you want this box to be? And columns, how wide do you want it to be? Those are rough estimates of characters. I'll just let it be for right now. I don't use a lot of text areas because I don't usually ask people for a lot of text. Usually a text box will do it. There's the note that says don't use tabs or enter keys or anything between those two tabs. All right, next kind of input. Again, I need a break. Next kind of input is password input. Looks a lot like a text input. Has a lot of the same features. Oops. My text area needs an ID. Otherwise, I won't be able to refer to it. Notice there's no errors, but I won't be able to refer to it in JavaScript. And it should have a name. My password is an input type equals password. ID equals and its name equals. You can again set a size if I want it to be the same size as the ones up above. And I believe I can put placeholder text in there. And break. So my placeholder, type, with dots. Now this is pretty ugly, but I'm not done yet. Hang in there. What's with the stars? You getting stars? No. It's my last pass, my password thing. My password program is detecting that, oh look, there's a username and password. Do you want me to save those for you for future reference? And it hasn't asked me. If it has, I've been ignoring it. So if you're not getting stars, that's normal. Questions about those? One thing to remember is that the data that's being typed in your password boxes is actually sent to the server. We'll see that here in just a second. I'm getting ready to add my button. Okay. That data is sent to the server. That's normal. That's normal. What some websites have started doing is using JavaScript to encrypt what you type right away. As soon as you type it, they encrypt it. Type a couple more letters, they encrypt it. Type more, they encrypt it. But that text box always has the text behind it, and there's actually some programs out there that let you snoop at that and basically remove the dots and see what's behind it.
Also, if they encrypt it in the JavaScript, you can see what their encryption algorithm is.
Yes, but then you still have to have the reverse engineering tool, and a lot of those, it's not real easy to do anyways. So remember that. Okay, buttons. A lot of different ways we can do buttons. Almost annoying how many different ways there are. The simple version is to do an input. And I don't need labels for my buttons. The labels go in the buttons. So I'm going to do an input type equals submit. Remember, web pages really just recognize two kinds of buttons, submit and reset. The submit button sends the data to the server. The reset button puts every field back to its original state. If you have a value, a default value in the text boxes, when you reset, it resets those to those values. So it's just the two. Everything else is done by JavaScript. There are other kinds of buttons that are not necessarily submit buttons, that are not necessarily reset buttons. But we can write JavaScript so that when the button is clicked, because it has an ID, then we can write code to respond to that button the way we want, and we actually will. And even if it's a submit button like this, we can write code, and before the submit happens, we can intercept it and cancel it if we need to. In web data management, next semester you'll give your buttons names. This is optional. Sometimes you don't care. I mean, there's only one submit button. Why do I have to give it a name so that the server knows which button it was? Well, in the future, we'll have multiple submit buttons. A submit for update, a submit for cancel, a submit for save, a submit for delete. They're all submit buttons. So I'm done with the form, do something. On the server side, we need to ask which button was it? Delete, save, update, which one? And process accordingly. So let's get in the habit. And here I do leave the prefix because when it gets over on that end, it's still a button. This is just the name of the button that will be sent to the server in case the server needs it. Let's stop there for right now. Save that, refresh, F5, there's my button, and I don't remember when this happened, but the text on the button changed from submit to submit query, which seems kind of dumb. Good news is we can change it, and we will. But first, let's just type some stuff in here. And then we can submit the form. Now that there's a button that says submit, the actual submit action happens. That's the action that we defined in the form itself. So what's now going to happen is this data is going to be sent to my web server to the HTML form test page. It's a PHP page. It has processing in it that takes all this data, spits it up, and gives you this. So there's the field name, field name, field name. The data that was in there, notice my password is not encrypted. Okay. And then button submit just lets me know who did it. If I hadn't named the button, that last row wouldn't be there. It still submits, it just doesn't send the name of the button to the web server, and so the web server doesn't know who it is. Let me try one more thing real quick here. You don't have to follow along. I'm going to change my method to get. Remember, there's two methods, get and post, and the get, when it returns, has data built into it. So now if I go back here and reset this page, better save that. For some reason the data didn't come, but notice up here, that's the difference between get. When it comes back, it saves this data for you. Well, why would I want to do that? Maybe you're going to IMDb and you're doing a search. The next time you come back to IMDb 5 weeks from now, if you bookmark this page with all that stuff in it, it'll have the same search information in there. So you can actually bookmark this with data in it. It's convenient, but also fairly insecure. And for some reason, it didn't display the data. I don't understand that part. Oh, I know why. I wrote this page. I got to go modify this page. It's written to only read the post data. On the server side, you can say, get me the post data, or if there is any, get me the get data. And I wrote it so long ago that I didn't know about the request data, which is both. You'll learn all that next semester. Sheila's going, oh yeah, I remember that. Okay, so that's why this is not coming up, and that's why thou shalt always in this class use post. Just wanted to show you the difference. The data got sent to the server. I just didn't write the server end properly to get the data and display it. But it did get sent back, as you saw, in the address bar so that you can bookmark it. And if I went back to that page, it could have all that data and plug it in. So there's a submit button. We're going to add another one. Type equals reset. ID equals. And these I don't normally name because they never get sent to the server. The reset command is simply a command that is local. Resets your form. You can give it an ID so that you can intercept it and maybe ask the user using JavaScript, oh, you're going to wipe out the form. Are you sure you know what you're doing? Did you really mean to click on that button? While we're here, if we want to change the text that's on the buttons, we can say value, I think it's value, double check my notes. Type value equals caption, and I'm supposed to have send data and clear form. Definitely don't like that one. I think the reset button still says reset. Yep. So if you want something else there, you can change it. If you like reset, you don't have to give it a value. Type some junk in here, type some more junk in there, and some junk in here, and reset. And notice this went back to its original value, not to the empty. Okay, before we take a break, I'd like to clean this up a little bit because this is kind of ugly. And if I had big old long labels here, it would be even uglier. Because these are all smushed right up against each other with taking up the minimal amount of space necessary. I've created a CSS file. Unfortunately, I tucked it away, so let's see, where did I put this stuff? Unit 4, nope, it's not Unit 4. It's Unit 6. If you go back out to the Unit 6 start, you'll find Form CSS. Move that to the CSS folder. Should have just dropped it in there. And while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to open that up so we can look at it in a minute. But first, let's go back to the main evaluation form and link that in. So here's a link command that I can steal. It's called forms.css and it's in the CSS file. Save that, refresh the form, and that didn't do what I wanted it to. Oh, I know why. The reason it didn't work is because the CSS file uses a class called form style. I need to apply that to the form itself. Capital S. Just the form, not the pieces parts. As we'll see when we look at the CSS, the pieces parts are covered because they're always embedded inside of a form style. Oh, that's awesome. You were supposed to say that. Why am I doing my own patting on the back? Except for the buttons. Okay? The buttons are not pushed over because these labels are now a fixed size and there's no label in front of the buttons. So in order to make my buttons line up with the inputs the way I want, I'm just going to put a label in here that has a non-breaking space in it. And yes, I have to use a label because the label is styled to be 150 pixels wide or 150 characters wide or whatever I picked. All the labels are the same size, so if I want the labels over here in this margin, I want the buttons pushed over, just give it a label. And so that's the style that I use in all my forms. We're not done yet, but it allows all this stuff to line up. And my labels are aligned to the right. Notice that this comments used to be at the bottom of the box. Now it's at the top of the box, where it makes more sense. All it's doing is taking these inputs and aligning them. So let's just take a quick look at the style. There's not much to it. Notice how everything has form style in front. That way, if you have labels or buttons or something that is not part of a form, they're not affected by this. All my labels are aligned to the right. They float to the left, which means the object next to it is floated. Okay. Vertically aligned to the top with a width of 175 pixels. If you've got a label that's this long, you can extend that. If all your labels are itty bitty, you can shrink that. You just change this one number and it adjusts the whole form so that all the labels stay right aligned near the left margin someplace. A little bit of padding between my label and the input so there's more space, and just in case somebody else is messing around with fonts, I make the font go back to normal. If you don't want normal weight font, then take that out. You can boldface it. You can change this as much as you want. This is just my starter. Every one of my inputs and text areas and selects, which are list boxes and buttons, have a bottom margin of 10 pixels. That's what adds this spacing here. All of my input fields. Okay. Set the float back to none for a field set. Oh, field set is radio buttons. It's kind of like a group box. So that one's a little special. Check boxes don't have a left margin. Form style breaks clears the wrapping because the inputs are wrapped, the labels float. And so every time you hit a break, it stops floating, basically starts a new line. Otherwise, all the things would go shooting across the page.
So you just list field set input instead of just field set?
Field set is a tag
It's a tag.
that
So
we're
now
going to
you have-
use later. Okay? It's a field set is a group box for radio buttons,
Yeah.
basically. When
so
we
why
put the
is it
field,
field set input instead of just field set comma
No, this says if it's an input that's inside a field set.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So I can't just put input here because that covers a lot of this other stuff. If it's an input that's inside a field set, set its float to none so that my radio buttons go down and the text comes next to them. And then finally, if you have images inside your form style for my error icons that we don't have right now until next unit, float them a little bit on the left and align them to the top so that the error markers show up. We're going to use, I use the same error markers I use in Visual Studio, a little red ball that sits here, here, or here if there's an error. So 5 pixels over, and if it's a text area like this, stick it up on the top instead of on the bottom. Finally, there's one more style, and that's what I call a flow label. If you have a label and you designate the label as a flow label class, so this is a flow label inside of my form, we set its float to none. So if you have labels, particularly labels that go next to checkboxes or labels that you want to tack onto the end of something, you can set the flow label style and it will not float. It'll just keep attaching, and we'll see some examples of that. Pretty sure it's for text boxes because my labels are all on the left. Well, I like my labels for checkboxes to be on the right. I have to designate their class as flow labels so they flow with the object instead of making things wrap. Brittany?
So you have almost everything there in form style, so you can just put it in the one
Just put it in the form, yep.
Okay.
And everything else, as long as it's a label or an input area. I've covered just about everything that I can think of because most of our inputs are inputs themselves. There are text areas and selects, those are list boxes, and we can define a button that is not an input. We'll do that after the break, right, to spruce them up a little bit. But they all get treated the same way with some spacing. Okay, so now my form's looking halfway decent, and again, if you don't like that, change the styles, but it gives you something to start from that gives you a halfway decent looking form when you're done, but you still have to know some of the rules, like a break between each one of the fields. And if you want stuff pushed over that doesn't have a label, you might want to give it a label anyways that's empty just so it pushes it over to line up with everybody else.